Hello, welcome to our year-end tariff update webinar. I'm Nick Esposito, your host today. I'm TRG's Business Development Manager. Joining me today is our panel of experts on customs and international trade. From Strix, we have Gregg Cummings, who is the managing partner of Strix and a licensed customs broker. Many of you have recognized his voice from the previous tariff webinars. Joining us today from TRG is Rachel Bowman, our bond claims manager, as well as our internal customs data expert. This webinar is being presented by Strix and Risk Guaranty. We're located in the heart of downtown Bozeman, Montana. If you're ever in town, don't forget to stop by our shared office space on the second floor of the historic Rocking R Bar building. Both companies operate on a direct importer business model that is unique to the international trade community. As an important disclaimer, the information presented in this webinar is for information purposes only. It is not intended and does not constitute legal advice. We will be recording this webinar. It'll be available on YouTube for future reference. To be notified the moment it releases and to keep a pulse on TRG's educational videos, I highly recommend you subscribe to the YouTube channel. I'll drop a link in the chat in a little bit. If you have any questions during the presentation, submit them via the questions section of the webinar interface. The questions will be reviewed and answered by myself, Strix, or our team of licensed customs brokers after the webinar. If you have any additional questions outside the webinar, or if you'd like to be part of a community of trade professionals, join our Facebook group, International Trade Professionals-TRG. We frequently check the group for questions and encourage our members to start conversations amongst themselves if they have a common problem. Off to you, Greg.
All right, thanks very much, Nick. We do have a lot to cover today. Here are a couple of the topics. We're going to be introducing some additional tariff and items that are involved in importation. We're going to update you on the import tariff situation. Are there any announcements from the G20 Summit? Yes, there are. And what can you do and some of the tools that you can use to help out your situation? So after our last webinar, we had a lot of people who came back to us and said, you know, there's a lot more going on than just 232 and 301. And they are in fact correct. So we're going to go over a couple of those items today for those of you who are involved perhaps in 201 or Miscellaneous Tariff Bill Act of 2018. For those of you who are not familiar with Section 201, that is part of the Trade Act of 1974, and it's put in place to safeguard investigations resulting in increased tariffs on, to date, both washing machines and solar panels. Also, kind of on the good news, the Miscellaneous Tariff Bill of 2018 removed and reduced tariffs. Yes, there was actually a reduction in some tariffs this past year, and those were for businesses who'd used raw materials or some other intermediate products that couldn't be sourced domestically. So if you were involved in manufacturing and you couldn't get some of these bills, you saw perhaps some tariff relief this year. We're going to start with Section 201. Okay? Section 201 covers domestic industries that are seriously injured or threatened by increased imports and have involved or evolved from a petition to the US ITC for import relief. Now, the ITC determines whether an article that's being imported in many times such increased quantities that it will substantially or seriously injure a US industry that's producing an article or a group of products. Currently, washing machines and solar panels are being enforced, and bicycles, although they were briefly being considered, have since been withdrawn. Now, from 2012 to 2016, specifically, imports of washers into the United States increased very dramatically, causing some pretty substantial loss to domestic producers. So by 2016, domestic producers were running multi-million-dollar operating losses. So in 2017, Whirlpool requested to the ITC, and an investigation was initiated under Section 201 of the Trade Act of 1974. Now, the interesting thing about this is 201 is part of the Trade Act, but it must be imposed by the president. So on February 7th, Trump did make effective tariffs under 201 for washing machines. But here's how it looks, and here's how 201 kind of comes to be put into effect. Going back to 2011, Whirlpool filed a petition with Department of Commerce for anti-dumping. They were looking at both Korea and Mexico dumping or subsidizing an aggressive downward pricing strategy for products produced by LG and Samsung. So Commerce issued anti-dumping countervailing duties, and what happened? They shifted production to China. Department of Commerce followed to China, but look at the timeline. Took 2 years. So anti-dumping was issued on Chinese. Another shift in production occurred, this time to Thailand and Vietnam. And so Whirlpool went to 201 to try and seek remediation. And so that investigation showed that there was substantial injury to domestic producers, which then resulted in hopefully some good things where Samsung and LG announced domestic production would be moved in part to both South Carolina and Tennessee. Now, in 2018, the president did approve under 201 tariffs for washing machines, and they did become effective. So it looks something like this. When 201 goes into place, it's a multi-year strategy. So in this case, it almost looks like a quota from a standpoint that the first 1.2 million units in year one will be 20%, and then all subsequent import finished washers would jump up to 50%. Same for covered parts, 50% and with an exclusion from the tariff for the first 50,000 units. It is, again, a multi-year strategy. So in year two, 18 and 45% for finished washers, moving to 16 and 40, and 45% and 40 for parts. So very interesting, a little bit different. Likewise for solar cells, a lot more people involved in the solar industry. But from 2012 to 2016, we saw the same thing happen, spurred by artificially low-priced solar cells and modules specifically from China. So in May of 2017, there was a petition from Sunniva that later joined by Solar World to the ITC, which initiated an investigation under 201. And in early 2018, again, the president did agree and made those tariffs effective. Now, why would we use 201? And I think that the solar panel example is a good one because it speaks specifically to an industrial plan and focus by China. They targeted solar production capacity of not just solar cells, but also modules, but they were using state incentives, subsidies, and tariffs into China to strengthen and create this global supply chain. So what happened was, beginning in 2005, there was a renewable energy promotion within China with very specific capacity targets, which included solar products. And the Chinese State Council listed in the renewable energy, this was one of 7 very strategic emerging industries that were eligible for special incentives and loans. And this goes back to 2010. So again, unfair trade practices which could lower prices for goods that got exported to other countries. So what we've seen in the solar cell and module area, that China provided subsidies and financing to its domestic solar companies, encouraged the development of geographic industrial clusters and components, so creating literally a supply chain from scratch within China with tremendous incentives to do so. And China, was very targeted in increasing those efficiencies, R&D expenditures, and the manufacturing scale. They were out to take on that industry. So what happened? Following these state-directed initiatives, Chinese global share of solar cell production skyrocketed. It was 7% in 2005 and jumped to 61% in 2012. Today, China dominates global supply chain capacity and accounts for nearly 70% of total planned global capacity and expansions for the first half of 2017. So 60% of the world's solar cells and 71% of solar modules are now part of that production and supply chain. So the journey kind of looks like this. Again, started with reviewing by the Department of Commerce back in 2011, showed that China subsidized its producers. By 2012, anti-dumping, countervailing were imposed. Chinese producers evaded this through loopholes and also relocated production to Taiwan. Department of Commerce follows. Again, it took a year, a little bit more than a year to do that. And then Chinese producers responded by moving production abroad yet again, this time to Malaysia, Singapore, Germany, and Korea. But again, they're subsidizing this. So solar panels were then reviewed by the ITC under 201. So in 2017, we found that U.S. solar industry production had almost completely disappeared because of this predatory pricing and incentive strategies. 25 companies closed since 2012. The remaining 2 U.S. producers of solar cells declared bankruptcy, ceased production in 2017. And so in May of 2017, based on these petitions, the ITC did institute an investigation of 201 under the Trade Act of 74. The president did agree. Tariffs have been put in place. And again, 201 is specific to an HTS, not a country of origin. Okay, that's what makes it so powerful. So if industries are perceived to be using those continued incentives and unfair trade practices and just moving production around the world, then using 201 can combat that and combat it directly. So we've got a 4-year tariff scheme. The increase in year 1 to 30%, with year 2s through 4s going from 25 to 20 and eventually 15%. So again, a couple of facts on 201, how it works. The relief is proposed by the ITC, and it's advisory. So they do the hard work, the heavy lifting, if you will, and then it becomes up to the president and the current administration in place on whether or not a final decision to grant that relief and the form, amount, and duration that might be put in place. So relief can be initially imposed for up to 4 years, extended to no more than 8. And any entries under Section 201 would be like a normal entry. It would liquidate normalies, so you wouldn't receive like a suspended liquidation as you would under anti-dumping or countervailing. So that's good for us if we're involved in those kinds of products, because it doesn't affect our bond in an adversarial way. What else was out there? We talked a little bit in the beginning about the Miscellaneous Tariff Bill of 2018, also known as MTB. On September 23rd, President Trump did sign the Miscellaneous Tariff Bill Act of 2018, and this removes or reduces tariffs on over 1,600 different HTSs. And as we mentioned, this is targeted for raw materials, intermediate products, those that might be part of manufacturing in the U.S., but can't be sourced domestically. So the intent is to help U.S. manufacturers not be at a disadvantage to their foreign competitors when they're sourcing for manufacturing components. And a tariff scheme, of course, that's exactly what it does. It raises the cost. So by correctly identifying those products that would possibly be under tariff but can't be sourced here, we're helping U.S. manufacturers. Now, the duty suspensions and reductions are effective for goods for this round as of October 13th. That was 30 days after the date of the enactment. The suspensions and reductions will last through 2020, through the end of 2020, and the next MTB petition cycle will be for goods and reductions in tariffs from 2021 to 23. Now, that's not going to begin until October 15 of next year. Now, of course, there's always some side issues that happened, and of the 1,600 items that were covered by the new law, unfortunately, roughly half are produced in China. So once again, we've got an overlap. And that, of course, could mean that you could have seen a reduction in the basic tariff for your MTB item, but it might fall under 301. Now, as we all know, 301 is generally a political and negotiating item. So it is aimed at China and not really looking specifically at the MTB items. I know that logic would dictate why wouldn't they do that, but that's not for us to really try and understand today. But for goods originating in China that are still subject to 301, it doesn't absolve you of your duty to pay 301 tariffs or 232 or 201 or otherwise. So it operates the same way that we showed in our last webinar. It's a stacked event. So even though your initial duty might have been reduced, you still may be required to pay the additional tariff that's in place. So it looks something like this. Your normal duty rate may be 10%. You might be part of 301, which means it's plus 25 for a total duty rate of 35%. If MTB lowered it from 10 to 2, that would be great. But if you were subject to 301, the 25 still remains in place, and the total duty rate is 27. Not quite as bad as 35, but still, unfortunately, a stacked result from the 301. If you have the joy of setting up a customs entry, this is a real party because you could have as many as 3 different tariffs affecting the entry. And this we just kind of put out there to show you that you could have be subject to 301 at 10%, even if the remaining tariff schemes had you at a duty-free level. So it stacks up, and if you get a little bit of an extra charge because of that, this is how it has to be done within a customs entry transmission. So most of the items that are going to receive result tariffs under MTB involve chemicals and foodstuffs. That's what we've found so far. So we'll see what happens next year and what items might be petitioned. But so far, the predominant areas that have been affected positively have been within chemicals and foodstuffs. We do have an HTS code list that can be found here. And once we send this out after today's webinar, you can log in and you can check to see if your goods might be part of MTB. So a quick recap on as the tariff turns, or wherever we find ourselves in this constant tariff environment. 232, for those of you involved in businesses for steel and aluminum, we've not really heard anything new. These tariffs were imposed back last summer, 25% on all steel, 10% on aluminum, and these were from a variety of countries of origin around the world. No drawback is possible for these. So if you bring the goods into the U.S., you're going to pay that tariff, and you can't escape it, even if your supply chain moves it back out. So you need to do a little planning there. Now, under investigation, 2 investigations do remain. Those are on automobiles and auto parts. That investigation began on the 23rd of May, 2018, and there's also investigation for uranium ore, which began July 18th. Now, both of these, the Department of Commerce has up to 270 days to conclude those investigations, at which point any resultant actions would be imposed very quickly, within 15 days of the President's determination that we would want to act. A quick chart. Looks relatively the same last time we spoke. Steel, 25% on steel, began June 1st, is in all countries with the exception of Argentina, Brazil, and South Korea, which cut separate deals, most of them involving now absolute quotas. For aluminum, 10%. It began on June 1st. Again, Argentina has absolute quotas outside of that, and South Korea has some non-quota entry type codes as well. But other than that, nothing has changed. The 2 investigations remain. These have not been subject to any relief or discussions of relief. 301, the big one, remains in place, the big one in the news. List 1, 25% on 34 billion of goods, began July 6th of this year. List 2, 25% on 16 billion worth of goods went into effect August 23rd. List 3, the one currently in the news, 10% on 200 billion worth, and this is where most people ended up getting hit, went into effect on September 24th, was scheduled to move up to 25% on January 1st. That has since been delayed. That is big time in the news, and we're going to talk about that a little bit further in a minute. The chart looks something like this. List 1, 25% July 6th. List 2, 25% August 23rd. List 3, 10%. That remains in effect. Began 24th. That date's still up in the air. Now, the news is still talking, and they're still floating that there could be a list 4. We would say that that is going to be delayed, as well as the tariff increase to 25% on list 3, but it's still out there. Still out there. So G20 Summit in Argentina. What happened? What happened? Well, potentially good news happened. Mr. Trump met with Mr. Jinping at the summit in Argentina. At that summit, the U.S. did agree to delay the scheduled increase on tariffs for list 3 from 10 to 25% and to begin negotiations with China. China agreed as part of that to reduce or remove tariffs on about 40% involving American-made cars, and they also agreed to an increase in purchases of energy, industrial products, and agricultural products. We haven't seen any specificity on that, but it's supposed to be very substantial. Now, originally, the tariffs on list 3 were going from 10 to 25% on January 1st. This has now been delayed 90 days, and there's been a little bit of misunderstanding out in the public. A lot of the news originally came out when this was first announced that the 90 days would be from January 1st and 90 days forward from there. The administration did come out and re-clarify to say that no, the 90 days begins on December 1st and will go through March 1st. Okay, so it's important, gives us about a month less, but the discussions are supposed to begin on how to resolve the important things to the U.S. and, of course, much of the other world too, on protection, non-trade barriers, cyber theft, and intellectual property. The White House has said that increase from 10 to 25% will go ahead if no concrete deal is reached within that 90-day period. So the pause has been issued, but what are the odds? What's the street saying about the likelihood of this happening? So Goldman says, unfortunately, it's about 20%. There's additional time to pursue negotiations, but the chance of a comprehensive deal is perhaps 20%. And the pause does prolong the period of uncertainty, which we all face as importers, and our trade relations between the two companies. And they go on further to say that the likely outcome is a continuation of the pause or some level of incremental escalation that might involve moving up to 25%, which we already know on the 200 billion that are in place. Now, China has agreed to reduce currently or remove tariffs on about 40% of American-made cars. Okay, and prior to Section 232 and 301, there was 15% duty rate on American-made cars. In retaliation, they put on an additional 25%. And although China has not really confirmed that they'll be removing or reducing this, this was a major part of those discussions. So the chart looks a little bit like this on what China has done with its tariffs. 15 plus 25 on 232, 25% on 301, 25% on list 2 of 301, and a 25, 20, 10, and 5 on the remaining items. China has agreed to substantially purchase energy, industrial products, agricultural products. Those purchases are supposed to begin soon, immediately. and the commitment to increase those imports probably involves very substantially the soybean industry, where demand rose about 25% in October compared to a year earlier. And if you take a look, soybeans is a very major export from the U.S. to China. A lot of demand there, and you see it spike, generally right after the harvest comes in the fall, but to some pretty significant levels. So this is an important part to the Farm Belt, which is, of course, from a political standpoint, very important to the administration. So this was an important relief that was achieved. Reactions, potential impacts from G20. What are the economists saying out there? What's going to really happen? So Goldman says reaching mutually agreeable compromise to roll back tariffs will be challenging. No doubt about that. Merrill Lynch says we've got to find out how big the trade gap is, how big the gap between the two partners in negotiation are willing to accept to make a deal. JP Morgan, you in the importing industry, you're going to have to be wary of making permanent decisions about your supply chain, where you're bringing goods in, until any kind of formal agreement is in place. TD Security says, structural issues are not the ones that can be easily tackled in the 90-day period. A lot of talk about how short really 90 days in it is in this kind of a thing, this kind of a negotiation. And Morgan Stanley says that the toughest demands that have been put out there by the U.S. Leaning on tariffs has worked. And so the U.S. has learned that a tariff scheme as a nudge, as a negotiating tactic has worked, and they're very likely to keep that in place. So, when we look at all of the pundits out there, can we find some kind of consensus on what's going on? And economists do seem to agree that coming to an agreement is going to be difficult, again, because of that short 90-day time frame. It's considered short. And also, both the U.S. and China are considered to be countries with very, very strong resolves and very long-term thinking. But again, the administration has seen that tariff tactics have yielded some success and are very likely to continue to use that in the future as part of negotiations. So we in the import world need to remain cautious when we're making our decisions about where we're buying our goods, what our likely costs and profit margins are going to be into next year. So we need to all stay really on top of news and stay close to the vest to see what's going on out there. How else is it affecting you? How else is it affecting the trade? And we're all very happy that there's been a delay in tariffs. It's positive news. But there's also been some side issues that have been part of it. I think it's been lost on no one, and perhaps many or most of you got very involved in saying, hey, if I'm paying 10% this fall and I really think it's going to 25 in January, let's get all we can get. Let's get all the product we can get and increase our inventories going into next year, and what we will hopefully be a lower price point. So the numbers are in. There was a 21% increase in shipments from China to the U.S. in September versus a year earlier. Very clearly, people trying to front run List 3 in particular. The numbers are just starting to come in November, but I can tell you they're very similar. Huge surges in imports from China as people try to bring goods in. And so what's that going to do as we make the turn? What's it going to do now? Do we have excess inventories in place? Will imports into the first quarter of 2019 be much smaller? And how is the shipping industry going to react? They saw greater than expected demand in the fall. Are they going to see lower than expected demand? We can tell you that in the brokerage and the self-filing industries right now, we kind of gauge what's going to happen next month, of course, when we start seeing ISFs come in. And ISFs do seem to be going down from a volume standpoint. So that seems to be playing itself out. Why are we in this tariff war? Why is this all happening? Okay. And it really started with China's Made in China 2025 policy. This came out in 2015, but it really gives some insight into the very aggressive approach by China moving forward in a number of what they deem to be very important areas. That initiative was to develop a local expertise in research and development and reduce China's reliance on foreign technology. It very specifically targeted emerging sectors, robots, clean energy, biotechnology, technology in general, because they wanted to move that country's manufacturing up what they called the value chain. Okay, the better, the higher the technology, the better the value, and that would then improve China's manufacturing capabilities and make them a major manufacturing power in direct competition with the United States. Okay, not as you might expect any country would want to do that. It's when they provide unfair incentives to do so when things start to find us in the place we are now. So that's been front of the entire situation we find ourselves in. And recently, literally in the past 2 days, we've seen not what we would call a capitulation, but we've seen an easing of those tensions, because this has been a focus of the U.S.'s reaction and the placement of tariffs on Made in China 2025. The Chinese government has come out and suggested a replacement of that plan. They've announced plans to give foreign companies greater access to their economy. Very good, very important. The change is in response, to the current situation, the tariff situation between China and the U.S. And they're looking at implementing the Made in China 2025, having that been removed from the list of local government priorities. Now, is that political? Is that visible? Is that really what's going to happen? We'll see, but it's a step in the right direction. Okay, step in the right direction. That's what we do all want to see and hope that will lead us to a final solution. So from an implementation of 232, 301, etc., what are we seeing from liquidation? And I'm going to let Rachel kind of take over here and talk a little bit about what we're seeing as far as entries and clearances and the experience specifically TRG is seeing in regards to liquidation of those entries. Rachel?
Thanks, Greg. So we talked about 232 liquidations in our previous webinar, so I'll briefly go over that. The normal liquidation timeline for a standard entry is about 314 days, 10 months after the date of entry. Entries for 232 goods, we started seeing liquidate within 3 to 4 months after their entry date, which is significantly quicker. It's still kind of speculation as to why, but we do believe it's because of the volatile nature of the tariffs and them being subject to rapid changes. This is data from an importer that was subject to 232 tariffs. So you can see their pre-232, their entries were not subject to the additional 10% tariff, and the liquidation still hadn't occurred from those January entries. Post 232 initiation, we saw entries made in March and April be subject to the 10% and also liquidate within 3 months of the date of entry, which is a lot faster. So goods subject to Section 301, we are seeing some of them liquidate faster, but not all. Again, normal liquidation timeline is about 314 days, and we have been seeing some of these 301 entries liquidate within 3 to 4 months. As a result, we are seeing importers receive supplemental duty bills for the additional 301 tariffs, and those come in the mail from the Revenue Division and are equal to the additional tariff that you're getting for 301, whether it's 25% or 10%. So this is an example of an importer that was subject to 301 tariffs. They were on list 3 and one of the list 1 or 2, 25% rate. Their entries prior to being subject to those lists hadn't liquidated. They were made in May. And then the September and December entries that were subject to the 301 lists, one of them has already liquidated at the end of November, and the other one hasn't. And again, we aren't really sure what is triggering the faster liquidation timeline, why some of them are liquidated quicker and some of them aren't, but it is important to note. Briefly, liquidation is the final assessment of money owed to customs based on current knowledge of duty rates and the value of the imported goods. It is the final phase of importing, and the final tally is determined based on the rate of duty that correlates with the HTS code of the goods. So if you're subject to 301, that includes the additional tariffs for that. And so seeing those close out earlier is a good thing. We did cover this a little bit more in depth in the previous webinar if you wanted to go listen to that. More unliquidated entry means more open liability to both the importer and the surety holding their bond. Expedited liquidation timeline is less outstanding exposure for both, which is a good thing. In addition to supplemental duty bills issued to importers, we have started to see new notices, specifically liquidated damages, being issued to importers for not including the 301 tariffs on their entries. This is a sample of a 5955A notice received by an importer from Customs. Mostly these notices contain a lot of data and only some of it is really important. So we're going to take a closer look at this 5955A and the information you need to be paying attention to. So specifically, this states that demand is made for a payment of, and that redacted bit is the amount of duties owed for this entry, which corresponds to the 301 duties. We saw this entry summary rejected by Customs because the 301 tariff code and duties were not included. And so they were issued a penalty for not refiling it.
Just real quick, I'm going to jump in here. What's interesting about this is the wording, because Customs in its 595AA says rejected by CBP. And for those of you in the brokerage or talking with your broker, we don't see from a brokerage clearance point of view a reject. What we saw was an entry that went through. And so it goes through, you get the 1C, it gets cleared, away it goes, and then Customs comes back later and they use the term rejected, and what they're really saying is you cleared it without the 301 tariff, so you owe those duties and fees. So there's been a little bit of misunderstanding just because of the nomenclature that they put on that.
Yep. And we are seeing that this is kind of Customs operating within the systems that they have currently in place to enforce the 301 tariffs. So we've seen them kind of handle that two different ways, by issuing supplemental duty bills upon liquidation or by creating these liquidated damages cases. So this is an example, again, of a 7501 that would have been filed correctly with the 301 tariff listed, as well as the regular HTS classification. And this is a list of the additional HTS codes that are to be used if you're subject to 301 or 232. We did also cover this more in depth in our previous webinar, but we just wanted to put it up here for a reference point, kind of what we're talking about when we're speaking to those additional codes.
All right, thanks, Rachel. I'm going to jump back here just real quickly. And this example of a 7501 is a refiled example. So if you received a notice that you had not paid duties or filed correctly under 301, your broker has to refile it. They have to refile it within 10 days, and you have to pay duties directly to the port. So that's, trying to clear that up. Hopefully not many people are subject to that, but that's how it gets done. So for, bond sufficiency is still being very closely evaluated by CBP for both single entry and continuous customs bonds. So if you're importing goods in particular from China, your bond you should be evaluating fairly regularly, because your duties, taxes, and fees have begun to jump. They begun to jump this fall, and so you're stacking up those values with customs. Now, of course, we're all wondering how are we, how whipsawed are we going to get by this if now we're trying to evaluate a bond for 10%. Is it going to go to 25? We don't really know. And it's really tough stuff out there. We kind of have to, play as conservative as we can and assume the 10% at least when we're looking at what we're going to set up as our bond into 2019. And that should take into account what the expectation for 10% duties on those goods would be for the entire year. Otherwise, customs is going to come back to you in 6 months and say, hey, you've exceeded the bond sufficiency, and we're going to ask you to increase it again. You don't want to do that, because every time you do, you're stacking bond values on top of each other from your liability and your surety's liability. So if customs comes out and they deem your bond insufficient, they have been doing so sometimes on an immediate basis, and you can't import until that new bond gets put into place. So,
and real quickly, I want to add, we are doing a webinar regarding specifically bond sufficiency next. That'll be our first one in the new year. So stay tuned for notices about that, because we'll be going into the details on how to figure this whole thing out.
Or get as close as we can to figuring it out, right? All right, so what can you do? We've kind of started to talk about that. And of course, staying informed through all of the different channels and news outlets that you look like. We send out a lot of emails from both Strix and TRG. You all have additional trusted sources, and it's time to stay informed. We can't afford to not be as up to date as possible, because this world is dynamic as it's ever been. For those of you out there who have looked to file exclusions, exclusion filing has only been allowed for List 1 and List 2. The requests for exclusions on List 2 are just about up. They're going to be due December 18th. If you look at how to do so, that's on this link here. And although List 3 exclusion dates have not opened yet, we expect that they will. And if you look at Exclusion 2 and Exclusion 1, it's going to be the same kind of information you're going to have to put together. So if you want to front run that, take a look at it. For those of you who have filed exclusions and or are thinking of doing so, what are your odds? They haven't been great to date, and that's again because we've got a combination of both political and negotiating things going on here. U.S. Trade Representatives received over 11,000 requests for exemptions on List 1 and 2. So far, only 612 have even reached the final stage of potential approval. That's not to say they will be approved, but it's a very low percentage. Almost 1,500 were rejected outright. We expect that's because the information was either incomplete or not even close to what was being asked for. But the odds remain tough. Rejections are outnumbering potential acceptances by almost 2.4 to 1. Now, that doesn't mean you don't do it, but let's all be pragmatic in what the outcome may be. As I just said, no exclusion process yet for List 3, and we're unlikely probably to see that while the 90-day extension is underway. But if anything happens, we will have emails out immediately on that. We get a lot of questions. In the middle of all this, tensions run high. We're all paying more for goods, trying to figure out margins, trying to deal with a crazy import environment. And everyone goes, why is customs doing this to us? This is customs' fault. What can I do? And I think we have to take a deep breath and understand that Customs and Border Protection is a partnership that we have. Bringing goods into the United States, importing is not a privilege, not a right, it's a privilege. And we have to look at it that way. All of the regulations that are in place, all of the things that we are subject to are laws enacted by Congress. They're not enacted by CBP. CBP is the enforcement arm. They look at the regulations, they put technology in place, and they enforce them. So it's our job from a service provider point of view to help you understand and abide by those regulations best you can so your supply chain moves forward. But we don't want to walk that gray line, because within this ACE environment, Customs has never before had the kind of technology they have to see what you're doing and to come after you if you're walking that gray line or stepping over it. And there's been there's a lot of positive things that happen with enforcement. This month, CBP seized containers with contraband Nike sneakers worth almost $2 million. This is a time of very aggressive enforcement of your intellectual property rights. So it's designed to take those brands and those technologies that you have worked very hard to create. They've got value, and to protect them from companies going out and creating false and counterfeit products. So on a typical day, CBP seizes over $3 million worth of products with those kinds of valuations, and so they're out there to protect us. I can tell you also, in particular in the hardwood and flooring section, if you're out there, one of the things, and this happened, a lot of questions from our previous webinar, what can I do? What can I do about avoiding these tariffs? It is based on country of origin. If a Chinese good leaves China and goes to another country and gets relabeled, it's still a country of origin of China. I think we all understand that's fraudulent activity. And Customs is on this, guys. They have offices and contacts all over the world. They're looking very closely at what the manufacturing capacity was for Vietnam, Malaysian, Singapore, other countries' ability to produce goods that are under 301, under these tariffs. So if all of a sudden you saw 100 million metric tons come out of a manufacturer last year, and this year it's 1 billion tons, it's likely they didn't increase manufacturing capacity that high. Customs is looking very closely at it, and they're catching people. So you've got to be aware that manufacturers of Chinese origin might be funneling goods illegally through, and we know of a formal investigation that just came out, a number of very large importers of hardwood goods, because they're mislabeling Chinese origin goods through a Vietnamese producer. So they're out there with enforcement, and they're tracking down not just people who are counterfeiting brands and intellectual property, but also country of origin fraud. We do have a free tool from Trade Risk Guaranty for your 301 lookup. And if you've got questions about this, it's become very, very complicated. I know we introduced a couple of other items under 201 and MTB. If you're concerned about whether or not you're doing things correctly, and you'd like some consultation, you can call us at Strix for more in-depth guidance from our licensed brokerage staff. But we really appreciate the time. And look, we've done a really good job. We had a lot of slides, a lot of stuff to cover today. So from 201 and MTB to updates on tariffs, G20, what you can do to help. Really appreciate the time today. We did want to hit a couple of questions that did come out. We got a lot of them, and I know Nick is trying to answer as we go, and we're going to take everyone's questions best we can and answer them. We've got the HTS lookup under 301, which also allows you to download PDFs. The most accurate way to determine if your goods that you're importing under 301 is to look them up. And you can look them up to the 8-digit HTS, and that will help you see if you happen to be subject to them. So another question, is there anything we can do? As an importer of Chinese goods, where can we legitimately avoid these tariffs? And really the only legitimate way to avoid them is to source the manufacturing from another country other than China that is being legitimately produced there. You can't have China rolling the goods through and relabeling them. So 301 is only applied to China. So if you can find other sources of manufacturer, then you can very legitimately avoid it. What's the best way to provide your HTS number for customs clearance to avoid any disputes? And what you can do there is get a scope ruling. You're able to submit your product description to customs import specialists. They're usually within the sea. And with that HTS code and the correct description, engineering, whatever is involved in that product, you can get a scope ruling from customs, which essentially assigns or pre-approves an HTS code. Now, as with anything with customs, not all is as it seems always, and although this kind of contradicts logic, sometimes an import specialist in a different port might disagree with that classification and still issue a CF-28. The very first thing you do is you send them that scope ruling, talk to your broker, talk to us if you need to, but that's a very quick way to help out with that. Will these tariffs ever go away? That's a great question. We don't know. We hope so. Everybody hopes so. I think it's fair to say that the intention of 301 is to be used as a negotiation tactic with China. We want to hit them up on intellectual property, technology transfer, the ability of U.S. companies to compete on an even keel when moving to China. These are big deals. And so tariffs are designed to bring them to the table, hopefully as part of hard negotiations. At the end of all this, the U.S. gets what it wanted to get, pre-tariff environment, if you will, and China gets the tariffs removed. That would be the best for all of us. Hopefully that's what's going to happen. We've got a 90-day reprieve. Hopefully the two sides are talking in a constructive way. My guess is you're going to know that soon. If it gets really bad, you'll know it soon. And as it continues, if things just stall and get tough, we probably won't hear that till very near the end. So thanks you again. Thank you from Strix. Again, we're a brokerage and a software company, so able to provide full service customs brokerage, freight forwarding, trucking, software filing. If you're doing this, if you'd like to do this yourself as a self-filer. Nick, I think you're going to finish up here.
Thanks, Greg. So we've thrown a ton of information at you guys today. I know there's a lot to digest with all of these tariffs. One thing we came out with here at TRG is the Tariff News resource. We've got a lot of resources on there. We've got articles, we've got HTS lists, all kinds of amazing stuff. The link's on there. Check it out. Stop on by. If you have any questions, there's a way to submit them via the form there. We'll get to each of the questions. We'll bounce it around our team. We'll get back to you with an answer. So if you have questions remaining from this webinar, go to the resource there, pop them in there, and then I'll get back to you, or Greg will, or we'll have one of us. Thank you, Greg. Thanks, Rachel. And thank you, everyone, for attending the webinar. You can reach out to Greg at inquiry@strixsmart.com. You can reach out to myself at nick.esposito at traderiskguaranty.com. You can also find us on all the social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, And most importantly, you can find us on YouTube. So if you like what you saw, if you want to stay informed, go to our YouTube channel, subscribe to it. We'll be releasing this webinar in a couple of days. It'll pop up there. Thanks again, guys.